Hey fellow nerds, on today's matchup we have got another Hindu kingdom that conquered half of the country and nobody talks about them. And is that right? Another group of invaders from Central Asia. On the saffron side, we have got the Sanskrit speaking ancestors of Andhra Pradesh or the Satvahana Empire. On the purple side, we have got the Buddhist defending foreigners from Central Asia who were the closest thing to being the direct descendants of Aryans. I feel like we have done this before. The Satavahanas, or as the Purans called them, the Andhras, lived unsurprisingly in the modern day area of Andhra Pradesh as well as Telangana and Maharashtra and Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh too. Interestingly enough, despite being Andhras, they spoke a language derived from Sanskrit instead of a language derived from Tamil. They were the empire that the Romans most traded with. They were founded around 70 BC and fell by 225 AD, which coincides with the golden age of Rome as well as classical China. They established trade routes across the world, and their coins have been found across the world, especially in Rome. In fact, a volcanic eruption in Pompeii preserved that city perfectly. It happened around 1st century AD, and in that you found many artifacts from Satvahana empires, from coins to statuettes. Romans wrote about how this particular empire emptied their coffers just so that they could get their wives good clothes. They were a Hindu kingdom and were Vaishnavites or Vishnu devotees. They believed in reaching Vishnu through the worship of Krishna. But unlike other Hindu kingdoms like the Shunga dynasty that came after Maurya Empire, they were highly tolerant towards the Buddhist and Jain people. In fact, it was them under whose patronage the second half of the Ajanta caves were built, which are largely Buddhist. One of the most fascinating part about this culture was the fact that sons were named after their mothers. The queens were said to have equal power to their male king counterpart. And there are many inscriptions left behind that were written by the king and his mother jointly. We don't know if this matrilineal attitude spread throughout the whole society or was it limited to the royal family. But the fact is, this is the empire with the most female sources left behind around this time in history. They had a decentralized power structure similar in many ways to the European feudalism, but they had a centralized coin making and tax raising system. Majority of the people, except for the poorest of the few, paid their taxes with coin. That's almost unheard of at this time period. In fact, even Rome struggled to do the same in their empire. So where did this rich, advanced and feminist for the time kingdom come from? It just kind of appeared. We have lost all sources that tell us about their origins outside of the Purans, which are considered religious retelling of the Indian history. They state that the first ruler of this empire took power by overthrowing the last emperor of the Kanva dynasty of Magad Empire. But isn't Magad Bihar and this is like Andhra Pradesh? Precisely why the source is considered dubious. Also, the founding of the Satvahana dynasty predates the founding of the Kanva dynasty. Satvahana kings rose to power contemporary to the Shunga Empire, although they weren't an empire yet back then. We do know the name of the first king though. His name was Semukhi, who was succeeded by his brother whose name was Kahana or Krishna. Krishna is the one who started their conquest. He was the one who conquered the region of modern day Nashik. His successor Satkarni I conquered Kalinga, while his successor Satkarni II conquered majority of the region that formed the core of the empire, like the Malwa region, the Vidarbha Valley, and the Narmada Valley. He had taken advantage of the chaos caused by the Scythians coming into India to conquer majority of the empire. After his rule, the Satavahanas would lose most of their western half of the empire to the Indo-Scythian people. But only a generation later, Gautamiputra Satkarni would conquer it back. Eventually, there would be a line of weak kings that would slowly start losing more and more land and control over their empire. And after multiple attempts of conquest by Scythians and Kushans, they would fall apart into multiple smaller kingdoms. After all, at their highest extent, they had stretched as much as half of the extent of the Roman Empire. Any empire that big is doomed to fail. And despite that, they had been in power over this region for 300 to 400 years. That's a major feat on its own. You have to understand that the Indian subcontinent is huge. Even just conquering the Deccan part of it makes you an empire half as big as the Roman Empire. Just makes you wonder how big Ashoka's Maurya Empire really was. Now let's talk about their major rival, the Indo-Saka kingdom. First question, what is a Saka? They are a Central Asian tribe from modern day Kazakhstan, and they are just like Mongols, horse archers. They didn't take too long to adopt Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, and eventually even Hinduism, as seen by the coins they minted. Before they came into India and Iran, they were a nomadic tribe, and the moment they entered these two civilized places, they started to settle down. They were displaced by an invading Chinese army, and so they decided to migrate into India and Iran and settle there. The first king from the Indo-Saka people to hold land was called Muawiz. He conquered the Gandhara region, which is pictured here, and in just 2 generations after that, they would end up conquering all of the lands of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. They seem to be the followers of Buddhism as seen by the many stupas they erected, but they were way more tolerant towards the indigenous beliefs of Hinduism and Jainism as well as the tribal beliefs. Their way of administration was very similar to that of Indo-Greeks. They left behind satraps, or in their language Kshatraps, behind to rule every region that they conquered. This is what they looked like. This is a relief from a local Buddhist school depicting them dancing. That's a kurta pajama. Something like that. I mean, if you look into the history of the kurta pajama, you will find that most of its influence comes from some Central Asian tribe or the other. And since there have been so many Central Asian invasions into India, they must have brought in those clothes over time, and Indians must have adopted that particular style of clothing over time. Eventually, they would be conquered by the Kushans, which would limit them to the lower half of their empire. From then on, they would start being called the Western Kshatraps, which is the best and the most extensively spreading dynasty. However, their northern counterparts were independent in all but name. They would conquer well into India and pay homage to their Kushan or Persian overlords, but it would actually be a conquest for them. Now, what are Kushans? Hold on. We will get to them in the next episode. That would be the round 3 of the battles through the Indian classical age. A new dynasty of the Western Kshatraps will be established under the king called Kastima. He would establish his capital in Ujjain, which is around in Madhya Pradesh. This was around 130 AD. His heir Rudraman would become one of the most significant emperors of his dynasty. He would go on to conquer this much land and would defeat the Satavahanas twice in battle. he would be the first king to convert to Hinduism, and he would go on to rule in a similarly decentralized manner as the Satavahanas. Within 20 years of his peak, his empire would decline. His heirs would be beaten by the Satavahana Empire, who by this point had become their cousins. Despite all of this, they still would somewhat rule over all of this land, even if they had to co-rule with the Kushans in the northern half and had to trade land back and forth with the Satavahanas in the southern half. They would conquer as far east as Patliputra. Eventually, Satavahanas would fall apart by 250 AD, and the Scythians or Indo-Scythian people would be the ones in charge of these areas until the rise of the Gupta Empire. Over time, their name would change from Central Asian names like Maoviz to Indian names like Rudrasimha or Rudraman. They started out as Zoroastrianism and their own type of pagan, and they converted quickly to Greek style Buddhists, and eventually they converted to Hindus. Over time, with the passing of each of their dynasties, of which there are 5, they became more and more Indian. Each of their dynasties deserve their own video at some point or the other. But for now, let's end that discussion here. They would continue to integrate with the local Indian population and eventually would be indistinguishable from the rest of Indians. And so, we have made it very close to the rise of the Gupta Empire. With the slow conversion of the Scythians into Hinduism from Buddhism, it would deal a major blow to the Buddhists of the time. You see, Buddhism was an urban religion and only the urban elite subscribed to it. Only the richest traders and the richest soldiers converted to it. So when 2 of the largest empires of the time converted to Hinduism, it ended the patronage to Buddhism slowly. Because at the grassroots level, most people subscribed to some form or the other of indigenous belief that had a Vedic coat of paint on it, or in the modern day we call it a form of Hinduism. We still have another video to go through before we talk about the rise of the Gupta Empire. A video in which even more bizarre things happened. So, see you next time.